juvenile delinquency to do an internship. And because addiction was an area that I was always interested in, what makes people want to stick needles in their arm and get high all the time, she said, well, there's an addiction treatment center in Harlem and I can get you placed there. And I said, let's do it. And I went in there, and unfortunately what I saw, it just really shocked me, because this was a place where addicts would come off the street and go through what's called cold turkey. And this is these withdrawals they would experience, where they would have terrible stomach pains, they would vomit a lot, they couldn't sleep, they were constantly sweating, terrible backaches, their skin would break out, and this experience would continue for about 10 to 14 days. And I said there's got to be a better way, and I was aware that there had been some suggestions that vitamin C occupied opioid receptor sites, and so I wondered if we use massive amounts of vitamin C, whether we could not help them reduce or possibly eliminate those cold turkey symptoms. And by gosh, it worked. You're going to think this is kind of crazy, and probably what I know today I would not have done yesterday. And possibly being naive really helped the situation out. But I developed a protocol where I would go as high as 250 grams, that's a quarter of a pound, of vitamin C a day orally. And what was interesting is, and by the way, that takes about 10 days to get up to that level, but I would start at about 10 grams, work my way to 20 grams, 60 grams, 100 grams, 150 grams, right up to 200, 250 grams rather quickly. And what the addicts were saying is that, give me more, because the more I gave them, the less symptoms they had. And so through that experience and working with scores and scores of addicts, I eventually sort of figured out exactly how much to use on day 1 through day 5, so that once they were experiencing their withdrawal symptoms, as they no longer were taking heroin, they would have absolutely no symptoms, no side effects, nothing during withdrawals. It was amazing to watch. And then when the blood test came back, because they were also doing some blood studies over by Columbia University, they found that their hepatitis A was just disappearing. So there was the support for the concept of it being an antiviral agent. So this was very, very fascinating, and I continued to do this throughout the summer and did fairly well in the class. Herskowitz was pretty impressed by the work that I did. But the City of New York medical director was not, and he accused me of practicing medicine without a license. So this is the first time in my life that I suddenly realized, gee, there's politics here in this whole scheme of things. And I'm a pretty assertive guy, and I don't like to be pushed around. Remember the neighborhood I lived in, and I'm white, and I did survive, and I'm alive today for a reason. So I looked him straight in the eye after meeting with him downtown, and I said, you know what, I'd really encourage you to file charges against me for practicing medicine without a license, because I'd like to take this whole thing public. And he looked at me like, he thought I was just going to cower down and stop. I said, I'm going right back there tonight, and I'm going to continue doing exactly what I'm doing. And if you want to have me arrested, by God, do it, because I'll be the first to picket in front of the Herald Tribune and the New York Times and any other newspaper I can and bring a story to the public. So do it. And, of course, he didn't. But eventually I had to go back to the University of New Mexico in September to continue my studies. But I continued to help heroin addicts when I got to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and that's going to be a very interesting story. Because 10 years later, after helping countless addicts in the barrios of Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, New Mexico, which have the second highest per capita use of heroin in the United States, about 10 years later, was the director of the Graduate Institute for Biosocial Research at City University in Seattle. City University today has the largest MBA program in the United States. Fortunately, my boss, the dean, was Dr. Clifford Simonson, who was a noted criminologist. He had at that time 6 textbooks being used by 800 universities and colleges in the United States in criminology. And it was Clifford who persuaded me to get out of government service, and you'll learn a little bit about what I did in my government work for some 9 years, to actually sort of park myself in an academic environment. And I was asked in 1978 to speak at a medical conference in Seattle to talk a little bit about my work on nutrition and behavior. And I happened to mention how I had used vitamin C starting in 1968 to treat heroin addicts. And in the audience was Dr. Janice Keller Phelps, who is a noted expert in alcohol and addiction treatment. She was formerly with the National Institute for Drug Abuse and with the Department of Juvenile Rehabilitation for the state of Maryland as their state medical director. And she was really incensed that I was working with heroin addicts in her own county, King County, which is, Seattle is part of King County. And she was really, really upset. And she said she was going to expose this fraud, this nonsense, this use of supplements as a way of treating heroin addicts. And I treated her very similar to the way I treated the medical doctor in New York City. And I said, go ahead, charge me, do whatever you've got to do. Because I've always believed that in the end, the truth always wins. It may not occur in our lifetime, but it will occur eventually. And Janice, however, was a very intelligent woman who decided that rather than just accuse me, which would have been very easy, of practicing medicine without a license in the state of Washington, she would actually try it and prove to herself and to her colleagues and to others and to me in particular that this was a worthless treatment modality. So that summer, she worked with 32 hardcore heroin addicts who were over 30 years old and who had spent a minimum of 15 years going through various federal, state, and private treatment programs. She calls me up the first week of August and she says, Alex, this is like a cure to cancer. This is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. It's exactly as you described at the conference. I've got to get people here from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So she called them up, and she knew the deputy director, and they arranged immediately for 3 of their top government officials from NIDA to come to Seattle, Washington. They spent 1 week in the city, and at the exit meeting, not only with her, but also with my university, so they met with the president, the executive vice president, the dean of the graduate school, again, Dr. Simonson, myself, and a few others, describing how remarkable it was what they had learned from watching how this works, and also interviewing not only people in programs, but accidentally during, I think it was a Thursday, they ran into people in the street that had heard that NIDA was there, and these addicts found these NIDA officials to tell them that the beauty of this treatment is that it could be done without necessarily checking into a rehabilitation facility. In other words, you could learn this protocol, share it with another addict, who might say, look, I'm using way too much heroin, I'm prostituting too much, I'm stealing too much to support my habit, I need to do something. And they would say, hey, I just was in this program, they're using vitamin C, here's how it's done, and it would work. And so they were just like, wow, we're going back to Washington, D.C., and we're going to get this program incorporated nationwide. 8 months went by. 8 months. And finally, the executive vice president, Dr. Civitello, said to Dr. Simonson, Cliff, why don't you give him a call and find out whatever happened to them? It's been months since their visit here, and we've never heard a thing. So Cliff called, and we were on a speakerphone, and this guy says to us that they calculated that over 80% of the rehabilitation worker in the addiction fields in the United States would be unemployed if this program was incorporated. And if I hadn't heard it, I wouldn't have believed it. And if there hadn't been witnesses listening to this, I mean, we literally, our jaws dropped, we looked at each other in total disbelief. And later we learned that one of the people that was on that field visit to Seattle, sister worked in New Orleans, Louisiana, as the director of one of the largest heroin addiction treatment facilities in the United States. And she calculated that virtually all of her staff would have to be laid off if this protocol was just handed over to addicts. So NIDA never took an official position, never wrote up this report, and this was a point in life where I got kind of mad. You get a little angry. It's sort of like a moment where you have to put on a uniform and fight for your country because it's under attack. And I said, this is truly ridiculous.